Hello everybody, today I am going to be reviewing The Love Witch. This film came out in 2016. It was directed by Anna Biller. Biller is a fascinating person to me. I think she's somebody who is compelling to some and then a little bit polarizing to others, but I think just as a woman, she's very, very passionate, very ambitious, but also one of the more visionary versatile artists that I've seen in a while. Somebody who really takes complete control of their vision. She's leading the way in almost every single department, I swear, when it comes to making her films. And she's somebody who picks up on the most minute details of film aesthetic throughout film history. She's a pastiche filmmaker who is using old images, or I should say old archetypes and old styles from a different time and then subverting them, giving us that point of view, but more through the female gaze rather than the male gaze. Her parents were both artists and her mother was a fashion designer, as I understand it. And I think that that's how she formed a very spirited point of view, one that has a lot of color and romance, but it is kind of tinged with arsenic. It's very artificial, but in the best ways. And the pastiche elements of it and the film influences that she's using are so plentiful. There are so many of them and they're so well done. They're so specific that they interweave to a point where you really just don't even recognize them anymore. It's almost just kind of like a subconscious, almost like subliminal messaging sort of thing. And it just becomes this very beautiful, ornate sort of melange of nostalgia. When it comes to the overall look and quality of it, you have a lot of 1960s and 1970s influence from pop culture. 60s in the sense of, you know, like the swingin' 60s, the romantic aspects of the 1960s. This is sort of like Captain Kirk masculinity. The glorification of the male philanderer, you know, chairman of the board, Mad Men-esque type of men at the time. Always with a gorgeous woman as the eye candy on the arm, but this one is more, again, it's more from the point of view of the woman who is supposed to be the eye candy. So the idea is to invert those tropes, as I said, and to probe, I think, that objectification. It's about women, I think, coming to terms with maybe new wave feminism as it exists today, but also the romanticism of the past. Romanticism really versus reality. Fantasy versus reality is a constant thing in this film. But the answer is never simple, and nothing in the film is simple, but it's just that sense of walking on a tightrope between that idealized, sexualized woman that might have been a symbol more prevalent at a different time, and then obviously the more modern sense where the woman seeks to be more of an individual. And it's less about pleasing someone and more about demanding respect. And I think this film asks interesting questions of whether one is more evolved than the other. I don't think that's an easy answer at all. I think with a lot of movies that consider themselves feminist fantasies or whatever, they lack the ability to tap into the facets of that sexual desire as they might be perceived in a dating situation. And there's often a tendency to narrow the scope of the ideas, narrow the scope of the confliction overall. But here, I just like that there's always this tug of war between these two ideas. The dominant versus the submissive, but you get that sense both from the woman and from the man, I think. So much of it has to do with how it is filmed, again, because it is a pastiche film. So you're always conscious of that. And this film, it's like it's filtered through some sort of kaleidoscope of retro pop culture, and it brings you into this very eccentric, very hallucinogenic place that sometimes does feel a little bit unfocused, but there's just something about it that has a spark and a freshness for me, and it really does explore themes that I'm not used to seeing from this point of view. And the 60s and the 70s, that's an era I'm very familiar with when it comes to pop culture, so naturally I'm very appreciative of what I'm seeing here. It is absolutely astounding, the attention to detail. The academia of the artist here, or the director, really shines through, as is intended, of course, but doing so with this sort of, it's a filter of like Eurotrash art house horror, but also just everything from Barbarella, this reminds me of, and also like the original Star Trek series for sure, that's a big one. Hitchcock, even like Alejandro Jodorowsky, The Wicker Man, Pagan Rituals for sure, and I could just go on and on and on. I'm telling you, it is never ending, the amount of nostalgic callbacks we see here. Just the textures of everything. I really, it's something that I want to look into more, how they were able to achieve the look of this film, because it really, I very rarely do I see it this closely matched. All of that folklore imagery and the ritual sort of imagery that I mentioned, and it's mixed with that that periwinkle tint that you might have gotten from the 1970s and that harsh backlighting from old late 60s television, but then all warped in like a Technicolor funk. And I say funk because this movie is not, I mean, it is a pleasant experience at times and certainly very visually pleasing at times, but the film itself is not always pleasant to experience. It's a weird sort of hazy feeling where you're lost almost. It's like you're trapped between this idea of reality and fantasy constantly being pulled back and forth. You have a fabulous main character here to guide you on that journey, I think. But yes, Elaine is our main character, played wonderfully by Samantha Robinson, who is the love witch. She is meant to be here the ideal fantasy, every man's ideal fantasy, and she plays it so well. I just love her delivery of the lines. The dialogue, of course, is meant to be very stilted, so it does feel like an old episode of like Get Smart or whatever. But yeah, she's really a product of the old world and stuck within the confines of that fantasy. But in her voice, she has this very nasally sort of feline, droopy voice. It's very reminiscent of like Lana Del Rey, and she certainly looks like her as well. But she also has this sort of like Kim Kardashian sort of Valley Girl thing going with the upward inflection that I also think is a great touch as well. But yeah, like I said, she looks like a mix of so many people. She reminds me of Barbarella, doesn't necessarily look like her, but reminds me of her, and even like Olivia Hussey, I think of from like the Zeffirelli version of Romeo and Juliet, especially during that Renaissance like fake wedding section. And she reminds me of like Megan Fox. This is like Megan Fox that started dating Machine Gun Kelly. 50s pinup vixen sort of smoldering ideal there. But I've always loved it when you get to see a movie from the point of view of the gorgeous woman, just because I really think that's something that you rarely see. I mean, usually when the gorgeous woman is the hero, she's more kind of idealized or seen in a certain way rather than really explored as somebody who is flawed. And this character is deeply flawed, deeply crazy, obsessive and toxic. The kind of gorgeous temptress that you have to avoid as a man, I think, because she is just the embodiment of male primal desire. You know, no matter how good you are, how good you think you are, she is meant to be that sort of magnet here. She arouses men in a way where they don't have control. Just being somebody who is so untouchable, so unreachable becomes a point of power for somebody like that. It's a very, very lonely existence, I'm sure. So she can use that as a power, but she also really does want that love, but I don't think she wants love nearly as much as she wants a sense of power or just a sense of control, and you feel a sense of sympathy for her. But you also find it to be quite disgusting at the same time. Because when you are objectified or hurt, mainly because your appearance is the focus so often, then, you become obsessed with the ideal that just can't be attained. But yeah, she is very much that Lana Del Rey sort of dreamy Lynchian fantasy where, it's almost like she's a tween girl that is writing fantasies in her diary about some James Dean lookalike. This is the type of woman that Elaine chooses to be. Now, is that a detriment or not? That's up for debate, certainly. But, as much as maybe like a third wave feminist might scoff at that, might turn their nose up at that, I think that they'd also admit as well, if you really got them to be open about it, that there is something intoxicating about who she is to a degree, because she does say that we're all little girls deep down, even though we are grown up. And I think a lot of women would absolutely agree with that. A lot of men would totally agree with that as well. But I really like having the character of Trish in contrast to Elaine representing that point of view, the third wave feminist point of view, or at least an aspect of it. But she's actually, I think, one of my very favorite characters. She is a break from the fantasy, I think, in the best way. She's a woman who maybe dreams of the fantasy and admits to it as well in the same way, but she's just more grounded. She is the realistic version of a wife, a modern day wife, I should say, a wife who wishes for the respect and maintaining that individuality. She's more about the equal partnership. And really, she seems like a happy person, and so does her husband. They really do. But it is that whiff of the fantasy, the drug that is Elaine, really, that can wreck an otherwise very normal, very stable marriage. I enjoy that this movie just constantly talks about love, love, love all the time. Love, this drunken fantasy sort of thing. And even the title has the word love in it. And yet I feel almost no sense of love in the entire film. Maybe you get it early on from Trish, just a sense of how she talks about her husband, but beyond that, it's very, very depleted. And that's the wonderful irony in it, I think. It's more an emphasis on the trappings, the social trappings in particular, but as well as the aesthetic trappings of romanticism and civility that often doom relationships between men and women. In the section with Richard especially, he seems like a very sweet, sort of dorky guy, but then when he is met with this ideal, gorgeous woman who both is submitting to him sexually in the way that maybe Trish doesn't do, but also becomes that Freudian nurturing figure that, is a natural impulse that maybe she cannot fulfill in the same way. It turns him into, just like it does a lot of men, it turns them into complete zombies. Addicted emotional wrecks, and it can seem very pathetic at times, but it's also very understandable because all of that ecstasy and that emotion from the man that can be unlocked is something that is, coveted in a way because men are taught to repress their emotions in society. But now they're suddenly uncontrollable, and that can be very jarring. And a lot of times, obviously, when somebody becomes too lovesick, the other person kind of backs away like, okay, that's a turnoff. But again, there's so much in this film of just like where you want to attain that bright, shiny thing, and then it just dims constantly. And that just brief encounter of perfection can wreck the rest of your life. It's like a flower that's just very briefly existing in reality, but then reality does rot the core, like ants that are eating an apple. But that's a very key point for our protagonist and one of her big flaws or her biggest weaknesses in the film. She is a fantasy fully, therefore she cannot thrive in reality in any way. She cannot really love because the way that she has been perceived obviously affects the way she perceives everything. So her distortions, her delusions keep her from being able to see a clear and natural path for herself. She is just really destructive and she's isolated, she's self-absorbed, and ultimately she is evil. But just all the things that go on within the body when you lock eyes with somebody from across the room, or like when you're going on a first date with somebody you're really interested in, there's so much that's going on underneath the surface. This Freudian need to complete a full circle of sorts is always seething beneath that civility, those first impressions, the possibility perhaps for an honest connection, but a lot of those things that I mentioned often keep us from having that honest connection. And when I was watching this movie, I kept thinking it was going to go in a certain direction, and it always diverted from my expectations. So as an example, when the movie begins, I'm thinking, okay, is this one of those examples of a woman who's like a vampire demon or something, where she has to, like Jennifer's Body, where she thrives on killing men, devouring their hearts to keep her beautiful? Or they could have gone the route where they have a very distinct difference between reality and fantasy. Like she has her fantasy world and then she goes back into reality, so it's more of a black and white thing. It could have been a lot more clear cut to this. And I do think sometimes the muddled aspects of everything in the movie can be a negative, but I think overall, I really, really love it. I think that the mood of everything is very, very unique. It creates an almost half awake sort of feeling. Like I've been up all night and I'm still kind of coming down from the buzz of mushrooms or something, but I'm not fully high. The movie is very windy like a snake constantly, always taking you to unexpected places, and tonally it is never settled on just one thing. It does feel very much like a bunch of subliminal messages from the past coming together to create something new, like a new sort of mosaic. And I admire just the craftsmanship, I think, most of all. At times I do think it feels a bit aimless in its intent with certain sections of the film. It does meander at times where I think it could have solidified into something that is more clear and more dynamic. But at the same time, there was something about the meandering, especially on a second viewing, the sleepiness and the strange, the quirkiness, the awkwardness of certain things that did add to that feeling, add to that kind of weird, eccentric, sleepy feeling I had. Though I think there are ways to shape it in a more interesting way at times. But overall, Biller is fascinating to me, as I said before. I know that she considers herself to be a feminist filmmaker, and obviously that's fine. I think she certainly has that spirit, but I know that a million critics talk about this movie as some sort of feminist film, but I think the reason why I like it is because it's more complex than that. I don't see it as some cut and dry, girl power sort of thing. It's more wrestling with the idea of feminism as it exists today. And that's just so much more interesting to me than the latter. But I constantly ask myself, where is Biller's mind when she's making this sort of movie, when she's writing this sort of movie? You know, is she more bitter here, or is she wanting to celebrate femininity? Is she wanting to reveal women in a certain way? Does she want to exploit them to a sense? And I think there's a mix of all of that. It is not at all one note in its depiction of these characters. And to me, it is, yes, the struggle of finding that sweet spot between feminism and that natural submissiveness that is inherently biological. And for men, it's more the idea of allowing that soft emotional center that is normally considered to be taboo in society to come forward and be nurtured in a healthy way without full destruction of the male ego, without, you know, fully latching on in this primal sense. I do compare a movie like this to something like Promising Young Woman, just because it came out not so long ago, because it is, you know, that movie was a revenge feminist fantasy is what it's considered. Yet for me, the feminist argument in the movie often felt underdeveloped or one-sided. I think mainly it's because it didn't allow the facets beyond more the basic third wave feminism to really flourish in an interesting way. And if it had done that, I think it could have been absolutely brilliant, because those are the more interesting questions. It's the darker questions. And yes, I think that film is more focused in certain ways, and I think maybe even more engaging in certain ways. But yet I find myself much more drawn to this one personally, The Love Witch. I'm just amazed again by the ambition. I'm amazed by how they were able to merge so many things into one film in a way that does feel almost homogenous, but also able to draw you in this very kind of soporific, sleepy sort of hypnosis. It is really a special and unique project that, yes, I do think is something especially cinephiles need to seek out. And that is the video. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'm going to plug my website as always. It is deepfocuslens.com. I am an artist and I do commission portraits and I sell prints of my work. If that's something you're interested in, you can always go to the website below. And if you have any questions about a commission or a print, you can always email me. My email is in the description box below. Also, I'd like to give a big shout out to my patrons. Thank you guys as always. If you are interested in becoming a patron, the link to support that is below, as well as the rest of my social media information. You can watch more videos here, and you can subscribe if you'd like. Catch you next time.